We're going to record this, like,
This meeting is being recorded.
just in case anyone wanted to know. There it is. So welcome everyone. We already started the conversation already. Today's gonna be a little different than usual. We partially out of design, partially out of need. We don't have a sort of a formal sort of presenter on a particular topic like we historically have done. We have a kind of an amalgam of conversation. We want to sort of open up some time here to kind of talk about where Unify is, where Nick is, where we're kind of headed with consent and some of the other initiatives that are sort of flowing through this group and related to this group. And Eric Jan, who's on the call here, he and I spoke this morning. He's put together some thoughts to help us sort of think through the and facilitate the conversation as we move forward. A lot of things are sort of happening out there. Thought it was a good moment to pause. We felt like it was better to hold the conversation today and just kind of keep the momentum going. There's just so many things going on, and it's a nice opportunity to be able to sort of connect in for an hour or so on related topics that many of us are touching in many ways here. But as we get started, there's a couple of new people on the group here. I just wanted to introduce folks or give you just a moment to say hello. Our tradition is just to say where you're from and what you're up to, how you got here. So if I might ask Neil, I think that you may be new to the group here. You recently joined here, so greetings and welcome.
Great, thank you, Daniel, and great to join the group here. I'm with Smart Logic, and I live in North Florida on a little island called Amelia Island. And I connected with Daniel through some past connections with folks I used to work with at IBM Watson Health that was at some point engaged with the group, I believe, in some way. Yep. So great to finally connect with you.
That's great. Welcome to the conversation today.
Thank you.
I think there's Amit. Welcome.
Hello. I've had this perpetual conflict with the call, except for a cancellation today. So I was happy to be able to join, and I got the right time, so I'm able to introduce myself. So, hello everyone. I'm Amit Trivedi. I'm the Senior Director of Health IT Standards and Informatics at HIMSS. I'm really excited to participate with this group and see what's going on. Like Dan, there's so many things going on. I'm trying to see where we can help connect the dots. I work a lot within the standards communities, both internationally and nationally. My team also supports our work with IHE International and IHE USA. We do some work with ONC. And I'm based out of Oceanside, California. Anybody who will be at this conference in a month, I'll be there. So look forward to connecting.
I'm sure we'll all bump into each other in Orlando. Great, welcome. I'm glad you made it today. I think we have a few new people as well. There's two folks who are on cell phones who I don't recognize your numbers, the 419 and the 702.
Hey, Daniel, it's Karen with the Stern Hill with 419.
Great, Karen. I should remember that. I want to change your name there.
And
yeah.
702 you might be seeing is Rita.
Oh, hey, Rita. All right, I'll take the liberty of putting your name into replacing your number there. So greetings and welcome there. I think everyone else has been here before. So hi, Mike. Thanks for joining. And Keela, I think you've been here before as well. So thanks for joining the conversation here. I wanted to just share a few things, and then we'll dive into the conversation here. And maybe a couple other folks joining us here. Interestingly, a couple of news items here that are happening. In fact, one of the overlaps with the conversation right now is this National Science Foundation OKN group that Brian and Eric reported out on last week a little bit on our submission there. I think Brian may still be there. They're working through some use cases that are happening. Eric, do you have any more info on that? Were you at that meeting at all today?
I attended all of it except for what's going on right now.
Okay.
Yeah, we submitted our use cases. It's been going well. They're having us kind of pitch the use cases. Um, it's amazing how strong the support is for knowledge graphs across the board. They're talking about making it so that all their 5-star data, linked data, RDF would be in data.gov. It's exciting. They're very much embracing NEAM. They're very excited about it. They want to have health and human services in and amongst. There's a lot of biomedical people too there as well, but like it's not all just like NASA and JPL kind of geographic stuff. It's also not just the hard sciences, but more also health and human services. So it's exciting to be there, and Brian and the NEAM team are doing a great job kind of supporting each other and working together to kind of go through their format. So I'm encouraged by it, and just looking to see where it goes.
That sounds great. I'm noticing a little bit of an issue with my Zoom here. I don't know if people, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
My screen is locked up a little bit, and I can't control. I got the little round blue thing happening here. So I might, Amanda, transfer those to you. Amanda?
Yeah. Now you're frozen, and I
Yeah.
can't really. Hold on.
Okay. Sorry, folks. If for some reason my computer goes down, just dial back in. If Amanda, if you don't have host capability, I can't even get to the.
Yeah, I don't have host capability right now, but if we do get kicked off, I should be able to log back in as you.
Okay. Well, I'll just keep going and see if we get. Hold on here. Weird. I've not experienced this before. Talking about cybersecurity. Maybe we invited the folks to this call here. I think I'll wait for the program to respond here. And so just a few more comments, and then I'll see if it resolves itself here. I mentioned that I think I mentioned last week we had applied and we got confirmation of our application for the European Social Network Conference, which is taking place in Hamburg, Germany in June, which is a sort of pan-Europe social and healthcare conference, IT focused, local and state and national and countries, sovereign countries will be there. And in our recent conversation we had with the ONC, they've agreed to join. So Mickey Tripathi said he would be on our panel with me and Jim, sort of representing kind of the work we're doing here at Unify and Nick, and then also with the consent work we're doing. So we're very excited about being able to sort of both have interest outside of the country on this topic, but also be able to spread the word by then what will be happening. So I think I was talking to myself there for a while. What was the last thing, if somebody would be so kind as to put me out of my misery here and let me know where I was yammering?
We heard you up until recently, Daniel.
Oh, okay.
You're going to Europe, and Mickey's going to be on the panel with you.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
That's great. Thanks. I don't know what happened to my computer here, but welcome everyone back to the call, or welcome me back to the call here. I guess I was mentioning the consent use service utility that's continuing to move forward. We're starting to do some planning sessions with some of the, obviously within our New York partners, and just starting that ball rolling. All of that is sort of with the intention of gaining incremental funding. I think I mentioned, you may have heard, we reached out to Ford and Robert Johnson Foundation, the Data Funders Collaborative, and there seems to be some interest in that. And then the last thing I just was saying that between Linux Foundation and Stewards of Change Institute, we've formed a memorandum of understanding to look at working together on these projects and other ones. And we're excited about, starting to create a home for some of this work so that it has the ability to sustain over time. And I was just saying, if Jim had anything you wanted to say about that, and I realized no one was hearing me, so you may then.
Well, I heard you now. Yeah, no, I'm
Excellent.
excited to continue to collaborate, and I think was one of the exciting things about potentially working together is, you know, what kind of opportunity we have with Linux Foundation, basically providing a digital public good type environments to manage any open source consent projects that we pursue, and do those in conjunction with the various standards development efforts. So we have an open source repository and the standards to be able to demonstrate in various pilots, and as well as being able to then combine that with other projects that I may have to be able to inculcate consent utilities as part of, you know, open source EMRs or IoT devices and some of the other data sharing, other projects we have. So thank you very much. Looking forward to participating.
Thanks a lot, Jim. So just a couple other.
Daniel.
Yeah, jump in.
Hi, Daniel. This is Jim Pasquale, and I just wanted to mention again to build on what Jim was just saying. I believe next week I'm going to be giving a presentation around consent and consent management from a Kantara perspective.
Right.
And if anyone is interested, one of the areas that we have more or less blanketed the consent work over is something called a personal data use record framework. And so we are building a specification that is end-to-end, that starts with traditionally people think of it as a service provider, and an individual service provider being, you know, just about any kind of entity. I often think about it as a requester and a responder back and forth. So there is lots of work going on around consent receipts, and advanced notice around consent.
And Jim, I don't work in that project, or haven't done any work in that project with Kantara, though I know Kay pretty well. But my colleagues Mark Lazar and Jan Lundqvist, who are also active on the ISO side, I think have contributed to the Kantara side, especially on consent receipts. And I always forget the ISO number for consent receipts. And
I'm going to spare everybody for a moment from my daughter's dog barking in the background because the delivery man is here. Oh, wait, I think she just stopped. But yeah, there is a lot of work that we've been taking now and in a sense cross-pollinating with each other. Actually, Jan Lindquist and a few other companies actually showed what they call a data sharing agreement, going end to end and taking the agreement and then actually putting it on a blockchain as a hash, as a not permissionless blockchain, a permission blockchain, where then the commitment actually becomes indisputable.
That is great. Well, it's definitely a good setup for next week for sure. And I'm hoping that, you know, as today's conversation evolves, that we're able to bring more of that into the conversation. A lot of people on this call are closely thinking about these topics and are obviously quite interested in them. So we look forward to that, to Jim presentation next week, and hopefully you and other folks can really help elucidate what's going on there, so we can build it into the work. And as I said earlier, you know, some of the work is beginning. We're starting to bring together folks to start to think about the use case, specifically in New York. Keela's on the phone here with Kathy, and I don't think Paul's on today, but really starting to roll up sleeves to look at that. And this is a good forum also for sort of pressure testing ideas, making sure that we're not recreating the wheel as appropriate, and also being able to move it forward with the communal knowledge here. So Kayla, this is a great place to do that as we go forward, and hopefully we'll be able to share that with everyone. Critical part of it. It's interesting. I just added a few more notes on the resources today. It's been an incredible day of SDOH focus. So I just got off a call. I think a couple of folks are on there with HIMSS. So HIMSS has a new SDOH committee, and they assembled that. There was also CDC assembled an advisory group run by EMI advisors on social determinants and public health. Both of these things were happening today. I think there was actually another call earlier in the day around that same topic. So there's a proliferation of conversations around what's happening with social determinants, which is, I guess, great, but a lot of different streams of traffic happening here, and staying sort of connected to all of them. There does seem to be a little bit of redundancy going on, so it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out over time. And a couple other notes on here. FAST is holding an open information session next week. There's a link to it here. And that one of the other things that the CDC folks talked about were a whole bunch of grants that they're putting out in the community here. And there's a link to that as well. So with that as background, I don't think we have any work group updates. Or Eric, I know that you guys met with ontologies. Maybe that's part of the presentation, unless you want to sort of do a quick update now and then sort of fold it into the conversation later.
Yeah, no, it's completely separate. The ontology work group met last week, and pretty productive meeting. We showed, sorry, I wasn't prepared to talk about the ontology work group too much, but we mainly, what were the areas? Let me get back on the ontology work group. I can go on to the next thing.
Okay, I surprised you on that one there. Okay, that's great. I thought you would have had that off the top of your head. It was, I actually sat in on the conversation, and it was, again, a pretty involved group of folks really thinking hard about some of this work here, which will be obviously underlying a lot of the more broad work we're doing here. So we'll reconvene on that as it percolates up. So as I was, as we were sort of preparing for today, and looking at what would be relevant at this point in time, this whole question about what sort of the strategic objectives of NIC and where we're headed around this human services interoperability. There's a lot of things happening now. And I thought, again, as I said, just taking the opportunity of people coming together to really facilitate a bit of this conversation, think a little bit more broadly, and maybe help sort of focus our attention as we go forward. As some of these projects begin to mature and take our attention and time, I want to make sure that they're relevant and they're meaningful to folks who are participating, both from a learning perspective, but also from supporting those initiatives. So we put together, actually Eric put together a few slides to sort of start to guide the conversation here a little bit. And so it's a bit of a experimentation in sort of real-time discussion around these topics. I know a lot of people are holding a lot of information about related parts of it. So I'm encouraging everyone to sort of jump in and to sort of engage as we go forward and look at sort of connecting the dots across the various projects we're doing. So Eric, do you want to share your screen on that and
sure.
kick us up here?
Sure, we'll do. By the way, just so we don't drop the ontology topic, so I pulled up in my notes from the meeting. Brian reported that his core ontology work is he's still working on it. By the way, at the OKN meeting, we met somebody who works in the biomedical field who's working on a top level architecture, and I introduced Brian to him. So hopefully we won't have to work by ourselves, and he's been working on it for a while. So hopefully we can just leverage that. He's trying to cross the regular fire, clinical world with the biomedical world. So it'll be pretty generic. But then also the main topic we covered was the Common Impact Data Standard that Mark Fox at the University of Toronto has proposed, they have a nonprofit organization in Canada called commonapproach.org. If you go to commonapproach.org website, it describes the Common Impact Data Standard, but essentially it's an ontology for a funding stream to declare, what their goals are, and then measure activities towards the achievement of the goal, and then measuring the impact of those activities. And we think it's a great thing. Mark was mainly he presented it in the past actually, but he was mainly approaching the group to talk about, well, would the group support his bid for a W3C standardization process, because one of the things you need to create a standard is a community backing you, and he's got some of that already, but since we're already a W3C Human Services Community group, would our forum help him go through the steps of a draft and a final recommendation for a standardization. So we discussed it, but there's a lot of to-dos, and it's a multi-year process to do that, but it could be very useful for Project Unify. Also, we had a visualization of the fire ontology in the meeting, which was vast and crazy looking. That was kind of interesting. And then we talked about the Center for Social Services Engineering. They're doing a joint ontology workshop in March. No, March is when the acceptance of it is. I'll post the URL to it after I'm done talking, but they have a whole thing going on with that. And then obviously we discussed the NEEM OKN, the 2 use cases plus the overall NEEM ontology at the meeting. So that was pretty exciting. So sorry, I was spacing on it. I just didn't want to do a completely
that's great
presentation on it.
Who knew you could have so much fun with ontologies?
Yeah, you want me to share my screen now with the
Yeah, why don't you get
discussion
go ahead.
topics? Okay, here we go.
Eric, I'm not sure if it's your microphone. I know that a couple people said that you're a little faint, so I don't know if it's
Okay,
just
I'll try to speak into the
speaking of the
microphone. Okay, cool.
Thanks.
I'll try cranking up my volume too. Okay, so the topic, this is not a presentation, it's a discussion, and these bullet points are meant just to kind of facilitate discussion amongst this group. And as Daniel alluded earlier, there are a lot of things happening right now with Project Unify, opportunities for Project Unify, different actors and different initiatives and different areas and even different jurisdictions that are looking at using us. One of which is the European Social Network. We're working with Common Approach in Canada, and there's other groups. So what we'd like to talk about is, how do we do a better job at being Project Unify, and how do we refine our objectives to achieve this interoperability? And just want to have a general discussion about where are we, where we go, and I kind of split it into a couple different areas. And so the first question is, how do we engage foundations, communities, governments to achieve better service delivery and outcomes? In other words, everything we do needs to be funded. If it's funded, it has to be related to those funders' goals. How do we align with those goals? How do we help them achieve their goals with our interoperability work? So I'm just going to open it up here. Some possible goals listed here that are, some are federal funding sources, CMMI and HUD, and these are broader sustainable development goals from the UN and social determinants of health. And then I mentioned the Common Approach ontology on achieving goals, and then obviously, if we have all these goals, how do we collect data for this? How do we get towards a point where we can give funders a model for implementing the data collection if they don't have existing methods? So and in a way that's done right. So I'm just going to stop talking and let people speak out on what they how we should do a better job of engaging communities, governments, and foundations. And anyone, just feel free to speak up. No need for hand raising. We're a small enough group.
Just give people a couple minutes to think about it as well.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Go ahead. Go, Chris.
I was just gonna say the thing that occurs to me is that it feels like, and someone kind of alluded to it earlier, is that there are a lot of moving parts right now. There are a lot of people who are looking at, certainly consent and some other issues. And I'll ask the bigger question of, is now the right time to be doing more to engage? Maybe it's a devil's advocate kind of question, doing more to engage, or is this a good time to let things settle a bit and see how it shakes out? I'm not advocating for that. I'm just asking because there are so many swirling parts.
I think it's a wonderful question, Chris, and I'll offer my perspective. You're exactly right. There is a bunch of stuff being done. And in my perspective, it runs the spectrum of, implementable and valuable and incremental to, hey, this is great space flight. Personal data stores with, segmented granular consent on the field basis is doable, but nobody's going to go for that right now. So to the extent to which we can participate, and to a certain extent, this seems like a great group to be the glue between various disparate efforts and provide both awareness and coordination of what someone else might be doing, but what we can do that's appropriate for one place. And speaking for the Linux Foundation, I expect to have multiple open source initiatives that might have going on that run the gamut of these various capabilities. That, item A is good for organization B that's in state C, and item 12 might be something we try over there. But there's a lot of talking, but not a lot of doing, I guess, to be blunt about it in some cases. And so we can unify and energize that. I think that would be valuable.
This is Catherine. I think we need really clear definition of what else is out there. As you guys mentioned, it's such a changing landscape. I mean, even if we were just to track just on a simple matrix, here's the organization, here's what their efforts are and how those efforts align with what we're doing. And then from there, prioritize which ones are most important for us to align with. Like everybody else, we have limited resources. So really clearly identifying and prioritizing, I think, is a critical component.
I figured out how to stick up my thumb, but I don't know how to put it down now.
There you go.
It times out after a while, man.
I wanted to echo what Catherine was saying. I think one of the challenges is, when you talk about a topic like consent, for example, which is obviously an area we've focused on, it's so broad. Like there's just so much there and so many components of it that if I'm a government agency or an organization that wants to engage with Project Unify around consent, it might be helpful to provide kind of ways in which they may engage. Like, here is what XYZ organization was having this specific issue around consent. This is what Project Unify delivered, and then they had this wonderful outcome. I think the problem is like if we go so broad and we're talking about consent, we risk people won't always hear the message when there's they're only thinking about how do we address this 42 CFR Part 2 consent related issue, or how do we address this COVID, getting data from, COVID to, the public health authorities to the school systems, right? So if organizations have a sense of like what an engagement would look like and what they're getting out of it, even if we can do that either by specifying like specific subtopics or more of from a process looking perspective, right? Like, here's the process. Anyways, those are my thoughts.
Catherine, you get your hand up?
Catherine again. Yeah, I also think it's important to track what's going on in the private sector. Not to dissuade anybody from the work that we're doing, but let's be real. The highly technical work is often done in the private sector because they have the appropriate funding to get it done, right? And I think it's important also to look at what is going on in the private sector and model what's effective there.
I want to pay attention to what's going on in the chat as well. We can unmute you, Courtney, if you're unintentionally muted by someone here. Yeah, something here. So let me just go back a second to kind of what Chris and Jim were saying, and now to Catherine, which is one of the things I'm hearing. Well, I'm hearing two things. One is foundations now for the first time are actually getting interested in sort of the technical components of things in a way that I haven't heard in a long ever before. They've typically remained at the policy level and at process level, but not really the technological level. And now since we really started through the NAA and now through the consent work, the response has been really positive and very encouraging, and you can see that language on their websites and their communication, which is different and new and interesting. And the question came up, especially relative to some of the conversations we were having with Ford Foundation, which was, so why should philanthropy do this? Why should they? Why shouldn't it just be private sector, or why should government just kind of do this work? And my perspective, I think our perspective has always been, it's, well, government doesn't do innovation particularly well, not particularly agile at doing it. And the mechanisms for actually that are needed and the kinds of activities that are needed are really hard to put into a statement of work. And so you need that agility and that expansiveness. And so that's, philanthropy in many ways are VC kind of oriented toward providing the capital that's needed to get the ideas out there so that they can be proven and then adopted and adapted. And I think that's the foundation for the consent, which really does hopefully check the box of saying, this is something very real that everybody needs, that we're, this group here and others around it are actually going to try to go do. So the go do part of it is very compelling, both to foundations and to government. And even this week in our conversation with the Office of National Coordinator, their interest in adopting, or at least starting to address consent, recognizing that it's been kicked down the road, has been very encouraging. And then to be able to bring a sort of a public-private partnership to the table, that conversation sort of is continuing to emerge. But what it looks like is that there will be at least one, if not several, public workshops around consent, and the recognition that this group here in particular can help sort of craft that agenda and address many of the topics. As you pointed out already, it is complex and there are so many areas of it. So I think we actually may have a very real opportunity to shape that conversation and that dialogue using consent as a topic of being able to sort of get into the conversation, which touches everything else. And I guess that's part of the reason for wanting this conversation today, is just to kind of open it up a little bit and say, how can we work as a community to literally do an agenda for consent or related things, all of the technical components that are related to that in a way that is informative nationally, and how we can bring in all of those other, many of those other groups to sort of inform and fill in the cracks in what we know and what we don't know.
This is Sonia. Speaking about the fact that foundations are actually looking at, something beyond governance and whatnot. I think it's a good opportunity to look at, for example, I mean, there are lots of organizations that are looking at social determinants of health, but I think that there's a blaring gap there when you're trying to coordinate data between human services and healthcare. We have fire, but it seems as if this could be completely off base, but from what I'm observing, the ONC has all of their funding and all their activities very centered on health. And so there seems to be a gap there. And so one of the things that I actually wanted to bring up was the opportunity to, start forming those conversations about doing something about that gap, developing an equivalent to a open community information exchange. There's a open health information exchange, but I think that there is a need for an equivalent, and also an equivalent for a ontology that could actually be a corollary to FIRE, right? Where we have an ontology and a vocabulary, and then we would be able to link that. Because until we have that social services, human services equivalent, I think we're going to end up going in circles. I mean, the work that a lot of these other organizations are doing is very health specific. It's like codes that are health centric. So.
Go ahead, Amit. Sorry.
I was going to say, I heard you had asked the question about why should philanthropy be doing this as opposed to government or private sector.
Yeah.
All of my standards initiatives are totally underfunded, right? That's one of the big issues. And then, a lot of the funding does come from vendors or the government if they're so inclined. But then that leaves us with a gap, I think. And so I think one of the biggest issues is around, health equity and interoperability, and why I think, we need more foundations and folks looking at this issue from just beyond, individual business drivers. But that said, back to maybe something Jim chatted in our chat about the why around consent, some of the values, et cetera. There's folks in other standards groups like OMG, BPM Plus, right? They do business process modeling. That may be an opportunity to bring in some of the value statements in terms of the why we're looking for this. But I think it's important to highlight that, just government funded or just private sector funded isn't enough. We need, it's a bigger community that's going to make advancements.
Yeah, thanks, Amit. And I don't want to wax philosophical too much, but particularly with what Jim brought up earlier and the groups he's in with Kantara and what I'm exposed to, we're dealing with significant philosophical differences in different parts of the world. Europeans view consent as a human right, that, to the greatest extent possible, there should be frameworks as to where your data is, what your data is being done. And there are groups in Europe that have pioneered the concepts of personal data stores, that you hold all your data and you get to choose who you share it with. That is obviously, as everyone here knows, very different from the way we do things in the US. And I think I remember earlier in the conversations, as in like last year at some point, just positing the questions around what is the balance, philosophical, legal, oriented, et cetera, between how much consent there is, what effective consent is, and how people on the phone here do their job. And I've been troubled by the fact that private sector and initiatives and even the guidance we've had from regulations and government agencies have always kind of defaulted to say, well, like the model for HIPAA, give us your data and don't worry, it's safe. And that is contrary to what consent's all about, which is I'll decide if it's safe and I'll decide whether or not I consent to give you that. And I think that there has been, thankfully, growth in the US, at least from what I've observed, certainly within the last year or two, around consent and surveillance capitalism and where is my data going. And that's what a lot of this comes down to, in my opinion.
So Jim and folks, the term we tend to use is called a PIMS, as a personal information management system. There are probably a handful to maybe a dozen of different, as you refer to them, private sector solutions that are offered today. Many of them are just very rudimentary, and in the fact that they allow an individual to obtain a copy of their data, which goes beyond just being able to log into a website with a set of credentials and see the data, kind of like what Epic does with my chart. Of course, we all know that, you know, with the new laws that have come into effect, especially around healthcare and I'm losing it. It's, what is it? The 2020 Cures Act, I believe, is what it is referred to, where the individual is entitled to a copy of that data in some downloadable format, at least out of what you see Epic has done and Cerna has done, and some of the other, there you go, thank you, Matt, the 21st Century Cures Act, that these companies are looking at different ways of putting, not only allowing that data to be downloaded, but then sharing that data. And one of the areas that we've seen a lot of traction from the original version or the original specification of a consent receipt coming out of the GDPR and some of the things that have gone on in Europe, is that a company that acquires that data can then generate from their record of the data that they've taken a receipt to hand to the individual. So what we've tried to do is mimic real life from technology, just like you go to the supermarket or the store, and when you're finished buying some goods, you get a physical receipt, version 1.1 of the consent receipt, which many of the people that Jim had mentioned, Mark Lazar and Jan Lindquist, myself, Andrew Hughes, Sal D'Agostino, and many others worked on putting that specification together, and it is used quite predominantly across the industry by lots of data protection officers that are now required, as we all know, when it comes to acquiring data, garnering that data, and the protecting that data. So I think we've split out at Kantara, we've split out the work groups to be working on a variety of areas that all come under identity and security. So making sure that the person is who they say they are, and all of the things that go behind that, the privacy behind that, and the personal data that goes within an individual. And so when you put all of those things together, we coin a term, or we use a term called centricity. The centricity being from the individual outbound, because it's information about the individual or information that has been generated by another entity about that individual. And you know, you can have lots and lots of different conversations about how that spawns out into reputation, and how an influential person may say something about another individual that is either positive or negative towards your reputation. But really, when you look at the basis of reputation and what your reputation is really based on today, it's your financial situation, your, so, you know, assets and what you own and what you owe, things of that nature, your health, your age, and your demographics. But, you know, kind of beyond that now in the digital world, we've gone far beyond those types of things. Folks will have to excuse me. I'm on a lot of medication at the moment, as I am coming out of the back end of kicking leukemia, and so I sometimes have to hesitate. I know what I want to say, but sometimes the words don't come out exactly the way I want it to come out. So hopefully things will get better. But I don't want you to think I am a babbling idiot, even though most I refer to me as one. And I kind of leave it at that. Hopefully I'll do a lot better next week when I do the presentation that I'm working on now.
Thanks.
I think this group has moved on to kind of the next slide already, and you kind of sidestepped the foundation and engaging funders. I mean, I did hear Amit say that we're low resourced. I certainly see that. You know, I don't think, you know, the NIC is flush with massive resources. I think we do need to clearly do a better job engaging foundations, communities, and governments, even though we have lots of pokers in the fire. Clearly we do. All of us do. And I just think that the NIC itself, I guess I'm referring to, how does Project Unify engage foundations, communities, and governments so that we have more resources to do all the cool stuff we want to do. So I think we haven't quite addressed number one. I do feel definitely that, I don't know if I framed it right, but we can go back to that. But we have a half an hour left, and I have 2 more slides, and really we're moving into this topic already. What methods should we use to achieve, you know, interoperability at the you know, the record level? And you know, PIMS, what Jim was talking about, you know, personal information management, and what both Jim St. Clair and Jim Pascal were talking about it's critical. And how do we, I guess my question is, how do we promote the building of this infrastructure in like a reference implementation so that people can build use cases, demonstrate use cases? In the health world, they have HAPI, the Health API server, and it's used in every single hackathon. Is like all the vendors, you know, connect to it. And it's kind of like the lingua franca. If you can communicate with a HAPI server, it's kind of like the de facto FHIR implementation. We don't have that in the human services world. And should we have something like that? I mean, it's very much revolutionized healthcare, I would argue. And, you know, obviously it would have to have FHIR APIs. It would have to have various basic human services and NEAM, you know, compatibility. But, you know, how do we get to a code base that's shareable? And this is where I'm going with it. And Jim and I were talking about this earlier today. Are we doing ourselves a disservice as far as collaboration on building things just by focusing on the US? Are there resources out there, or are there markets for our approach that would be better served if we broadened it to outside the US? For example, Health Level 7, it's worldwide, and there's broad participation and contribution from all different, you know, use cases to the effort. And I'm just wondering, you know, can we align ourselves with things like the European Social Network? I don't know, I just put European Network, Digital Public Goods Alliance, you know, for open source code. You know, how do we offer something like what the Open Health Information Exchange offers to a lot of low resourced countries, many of them in Africa, but they're places that can't afford Cerner and Epic to do their work. And maybe if we want to build something that's used immediately, that might be an approach. So I don't know what people think about this effort, especially vis-a-vis maybe the implementation of a PIM that's just a basic reference implementation that's got personal consent controls and data ownership.
No, I was going to actually ask Mary, if you're on. I know that I'm curious about your vision of MELD in response to sort of that happy, sort of de facto fire server, and how broadly you're thinking about that, because I know you've been gnawing on that bone for a while now within the Interoperability Institute.
Right. So, Eric, thank you for bringing up Happy. The MELD open source sandbox or immersive environment is based on Happy. Smile CDR is the original developer and curator of Happy. And so we are in happy dialogue with them about their backboard and some of the additional functionality that they would like to see for that healthcare API, and advancing that through an open source community, the interop community, which curates MELD. So I think that is in alignment, and certainly the efforts of Project Unify, as a member of Project Unify, and that interoperability to human services is on the docket for enabling. Much of that, as Amit suggests, goes through health equity need to answer Jim's question of the why, and that ultimately for the discrete data elements goes to gravity and some of the social determinants of health. A question on this one, Eric. OHIE, is that OpenHIE, the Reagan Strife?
Yeah, exactly. It's
That's
most
what I
of
thought it was.
what they,
I know that well.
I'm just saying most of what they use, as you know, is happy servers for a lot of their implementation. So it's just another case in point.
Yeah, I talked to their technical lead. Yeah, they haven't transitioned in many low resource settings. They've not transitioned to Fire. They've barely transitioned to the internet, but that's another story. We're having some dialogue about some of the open data registries that AWS is curating, and making cloud services available to low-income countries, enrolling HIE services like a provider directory, some of the services around identity management. Jim, it's been fantastic working with you on a deeper dive on some of that, but rolling some of that up into health data utilities that you can plug in with connection internet protocols to be able to enable our basic business processes. So on the OpenHIE and the worldwide adoption in low resource regions, while we're here, I got a communication this morning for others who in this community who have worked in global health. Paul Farmer of Partners in Health passed away on Monday in Rwanda. For those of you who knew Paul, he was an amazing medical anthropologist, so was sorry to hear of his passing.
Yep, thanks for sharing that. The message has been pinging around there. So, one of the things, Mary, that I've been, again, hearing a lot of, and we keep sort of drawing people back into is in addition to the healthcare and advanced directive and the clinical stuff, right? How do we bring the other things to the table in some kind of common format? And I know that's an area that as we're looking at interacting again through the consent work with education or probation or justice or other areas, the need to be able to do that, as we've been talking about for a while, is really critically upon us. And how do we architect for that so that it's actually it's for consent is one thing, but even more broadly, when you actually get into the data sharing, how do we make sure that there's an environment that can actually handle all those different kinds of formats and standards and things like that?
Yeah, I think one of the key priorities has to be around identity management. There are just so many challenges in that space. And I think for e-consent services broadly to be able to roll that up into a health data utility, that piece for the individual consumer needs to be addressed. I was talking earlier this week with somebody from the finance sector and doing a little bit of a deep dive on how they deal with identity management. Certainly money, right? We put it into a financial institution. They know things about our identity, and some of the finance standards that use to manage that. I have to say in health sector, because of the protections that are required by law related to HIPAA in particular and personal health information, and the advent of the 21st century cures and the consumer being responsible for their information. In that space, it's one thing to be responsible, but are we going to see a bloom of applications where naive consumers may be giving away their identity to not particularly trustworthy health sector repositories, giving their consent in ways that they don't realize?
Yeah, I would piggyback your point. Well, first of all, both points, the privacy issue, right? And what is an informed consumer? I mean, you could argue everybody who's done 23andMe has been caught in that trap, right? Their data has now all been sold. Not that they thought that was going to happen initially, but I think the point that you made about identity is something that we're all brushing under the rug very, happily, because it's a really big challenge to solve. And I think, the more we talk about it, we sort of just continue to brush over it. All the apps that are going to be used by the opening of 21st century cures rules are going to have pretty, I would assume, some pretty high level identity verification process, even if it's small. But then we're trying to link it up to data where the registrar said, "What's your name?" And then they just assume how to spell it. And so the problem really is at the point of registration, also at healthcare facilities, where there's just no verification happening. I mean, I'm overstating a little bit. There's very little verification of demographics at that point. I mean, we have people with their names spelled wrong. I mean, we have like Batman, who's a real person, but came in with a different name today and has flavors of superhero names every time he comes in. The idea that we're going to be able to link a vetted identity from an app or some other, portal where a person's taken the initiative to their really crappy health data that had no bar set for that data capture is a huge disconnect that we have to acknowledge and try to figure out how to address.
Well, and Keela, that raises one of those wonderful complexities of healthcare, is that particularly for stigmatized diseases, STIs and the like, the ability to have anonymous care provided.
That too.
We just have these wonderful complexities within the health sector. Yeah.
You know what? I love, the focus of identity, and I think we could even increase our, likelihood of getting foundation funding or government agency funding if we narrow the focus even further to something like, what are the challenges of low-income communities, specifically, or communities of color, around identity verification, right? Because you have, organizations like the Caring Alliance, you know, and all their demos and all sorts of things, you know, kind of like the 60,000 pound gorilla in the room, right? Tackling it on this kind of high level. Or, you know, we choose another angle where it's like, you know, let's just focus on identity at the intersection of schools and healthcare, right? Like that's one, we're likely to find more of an audience, you know, than, so that's just my 2 cents.
So Matt, I would offer, God bless the Karen Alliance, but they still are built around the model that there are identity service providers and people who are trusted resources to tell you what your identity is. And that model wouldn't work in Europe. I mean, it's up for debate in Europe, but
it doesn't work in low and middle income countries. Here's my blue card, go and they'll give you free drugs.
Yeah, Mary, you're exactly right. And I don't want to carry this to extremes, but using the LMIC model, there's good writings from the World Bank and others about digital identities and the potential problems that digital identities in the Karen Alliance model leaves, where if someone else is controlling your identity or someone else has contributions to validating your identity, you always have to be concerned about what the nefarious purposes of that organization are. And I don't mean to sound paranoid, but when you get into what we're talking about with particularly disadvantaged groups, or groups who are particularly sensitive about aspects of how they identify as themselves and their identity, and what that means for their consent to share data about themselves, it gets sticky, and it's not a problem that's getting any easier.
Yeah, so I think that the question then becomes like more of an existential question of, you know, what is the NIC? Do we want to focus more on the think tank of, you know, writing about this from a conceptual perspective, or do we want, is the idea of the NIC much more about the do component that Daniel Stein, like you talk about a lot about, we're going out and doing it, right? You know, my concern is just when you have a massive, there's lots of standards organizations playing out an identity, and you know, and lots of different aspects of the challenge, and we have limited resources. And so how do we find the niche of how we fit in comparison to the standards organizations in a way that can bring funding into this organization, right? So that's where my mind is, because these topics are very, very large. And conceptually, I don't disagree with anything you said, Jim. I'm just kind of looking at this problem from a different perspective. I'm not saying that the Karen Alliance is the end all and be all around identity. It's more a question of, I'm thinking about how do you translate ideas into funded actions that can move the ball down the court.
Yeah, of course, you're completely entitled to disagree with me, so we don't want to take that off the table. So.
Well, one of the things that, if I may talk, when we talk about identity, and trust me, folks, I am no expert when it comes to some of the work that's being done. I'm in the same boat, but I'm not in that wheelhouse per se. But you know, there's a lot of work going on with self-sovereign identity, and the notion of something called a DID, a distributed identity, in and itself. And of course, it involves a blockchain, and it's not a permissionless blockchain. It's a permissioned blockchain. It's more of a distributed architecture that's used for identity. But the simplest use case for a self-sovereign identity is that perhaps a healthcare provider, a bank, and a school could prove that an individual is 21 years old walking into a bar without that individual having to pull out a physical license or some other form of ID with all kinds of other PII, personal identifiable information, on it to show the bouncer, who is a questionable person to begin with, to walk through the door, especially for women and men for that matter, but probably more so for women. and self-sovereign identities and DIDs in this distributed environment that I kind of hopefully gave everyone a little bit of a landscape view of, circumvent those issues by showing proof that an individual is as old as, not only that they are who they say they are, but they are of the age required without sharing any other PII that we all give away. You know, all this digital exhaust and crumbs that we kind of leave behind inadvertently get vacuumed up and sucked up and used, where in some cases and used against us. So I think if you're looking to the future around identity, and it is that there, you know, it's what many of us have nightmares about every night when it comes to identity and identity management. It can't be centralized. And it needs to be distributed. It needs to be verifiable using assertions and claims, which is something that the blockchain is very good at being able to do. The problem at the moment is the business model and who pays for the verification, or how does verification get paid? Because there is some level of, and don't get this term confused with a permissionless blockchain versus a permissioned blockchain, but proof of work. In other words, how does those micro payments get spread out in a business model? Because let's face it, at the end of the day, it is all about following the dollar, as they say.
So Jim, I think that's a great, I'm sorry, that's a great conversation to make sure we sort of come back to again next week, but go ahead, Kel.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's interesting that you bring that up. I would highly recommend that you come to the Cardia working group of the Linux Foundation Public Health, where we are talking about those very things, not necessarily totally focused on identity. That's one layer, but being able to do predicate proofs and things like that with, you know, person being able to control what data is needed for the specific use cases that needs to be verified. So I suggest you check that out, and I can put the link to it in the chat.
But why don't you give us a 2-minute, if you don't mind, because I know we were supposed to try to do that last week, and we kind of, I think we talked about doing a brief overview of that, and I don't think we actually got to it. We just kind of rushed into stuff. Can you just give a couple headlines on that, Keela?
Sure. So Cardia, it was officially named Cardia when it got picked up by the Linux Foundation Public Health, and Jim is welcome to chime in here on what he'd like to do. But I'm actually the co-chair of the working group that meets on Thursdays, and we started, as most of these initiatives were started at the beginning of the pandemic, right? To say there's tools here that can be used to help solve this specific problem, but Cardia specifically is not limited to those use cases. The scenario that we're trying to solve in the sort of isolated COVID bubble, but then is applicable across various industries and also problems, is that an individual needs to have their verifiable data so that it's in their control in a decentralized, verifiable way. So they have it in their, in their internal repository. Let's say it's your phone, but there's metadata written to the blockchain. So there's nothing sensitive actually written on the ledgers, but the link to verify it. And then when you do the machine readable governance layer on verification, those machine readable governance layers can decide, do you only need to know like thumbs up, you're old enough to come into this club or not? Or do you need more information to be able to get past that verification check, right? And that's where the whole idea about credentials and a non-cred specifically is really valuable, because you can control at a data element level what's needed both on a presentation layer, but also in order to verify the specific use case that you're working toward.
Keela and Jim definitely want to look at that, but a question, why does Cardia not have Clear?
Because Clear is private and a
It
data
is,
aggregation
okay.
solution. So
That
it's
Mary.
not open source and it's not decentralized.
Interesting. Thank you for that.
They also had a massive data breach, in case you were not aware.
Oh, yeah.
I assume that that was coming for them. I mean, it was never.
If you really want to know a funny story, we, the Chic, what was previously Civitas, right? Previously
yeah.
Chic conference required people to use Clear to prove their vaccination status. They did no validation on the picture you submitted. So so it just so happens that Nancy Shatskin misplaced her vaccine card. And so she took a picture of her husband's card because they got vaccinated on the same days. And Clear said, "You're good, thumbs up." Wasn't even hers.
Yeah.
I love it.
I'll even confess the Linux Foundation used Clear for vaccine verification for their conferences. And I said, you have got to be kidding me. We're the world's home of the most expansive open source decentralized identity verifiable credential system. We're running pilots with Aruba around using our rules-based governance system, and you go to Clear.
Gotta love it.
Yep.
Path of least resistance.
Yeah, and there's some, you know, I'd be happy to have conversations about the compare and contrast also smart health cards, which are in this space too. That again is limited to COVID, but there's some nuance there too.
Yeah, and along those lines, I'm talking to Brian Anderson and MITRE about next steps for smart health cards and how to integrate them with our frameworks and to use Cardia as well.
Yeah, we need to bring the Linux Foundation to the global health development partnership. They're doing that patient summary, international patient summary, and the identity piece there could certainly use some support. I think the basic premise of what needs to be in that summary vaccination record, case in point, but an interesting activity all the same.
Well, Marion, I think you know this, but I've been working in the HL7 Advanced Directives group, which I'd share with everybody else. And to Jim's point, I've been suggesting models where you have a verifiable credential for your identity. It's tied to a decentralized identifier, which as Jim described as that unique cryptographic signature that I can put on an advanced directive. I'm in Colorado, my advanced directive is in Utah, the doctor needs to know, and here's an electronically verifiable way that I can offer consent to say, or a family guardian can say, you know, we agreed, we consent to give it to you. This is the most update version. This is the one that has been agreed upon, so forth and so on. So.
Yeah, I think the use case for the Global Development Health Partnership is more immigration, back to the Clear model, because so much of that is now electronic using various biometrics, but we digress from e-consent. And I have to go pick up kids, like I'm already 5 minutes late or whatever amount we're over.
Mary, I can tell you that the travel industry is involved in Cardia. So, and using verifiable credentials for things like passports and et cetera.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Keela and Jim.
Well, we are wrapping up our time here today anyway, so I wouldn't want you to be a delinquent picking up your kids, Mary. So we'll wrap up here in just a second there. Other thoughts before we sort of bring this to a close today?
So Eric, this is Dave. Just one quick question. When we first started Project Unify, a lot of it was about a systems level proof of concept. How do we tie all this together interoperably and so forth? Do you feel good that we're still chasing that, or have we kind of focused into bits and pieces that we're addressing, but really aren't paying enough attention to how this all gets knit together?
I mean, thanks, Dave. I think my personal opinion is that we're trying to slay the biggest dragons while their interoperability happens every day in a community level without having decentralized blockchain ID, without having perfectly working syncing e-consent for all vendors to approach. You can have a community information exchange with known individuals without a perfect identity schema, but that's verified by the community service organizations, and you can exchange data. Now, forgetting all about identity and consent and everything, this stuff is already being done and already works, and laws aren't being broken. And so they do need support for ontologies and data pathways, forgetting about all these larger dragons. And so, yeah, I do think that there are many aspects to this group, and I almost think we have to have these e-consent things in one group and another subgroup for ontologies. We can't have everything held up by the problems of identity and consent. While they're very important, you know, at the local level, you know, things we need ontologies, we need APIs that work at a local level where exchanges do happen, but are very clunky, and you know, they're using comma separated value bulk uploads, and then they're, you know, it's just a slow process of moving things around. And leaving consent and identity aside, we could improve those bulk uploads and such with APIs, with ontologies. We can eventually, you know, on the side, continue to work with these larger efforts for consent. But I just think that Unify, to tackle such a large thing as identity, or even pretend to, I think all we can pretend to do is weigh in on it, help and support and share notes. But is that the prime objective of this group? No, Dave. I would say that we need to split up and tackle, like what you were saying, some nuts and bolts things as well.
Yeah, the other point that I'd make, and then I'll let things go, is if we could find some functionality that could be put into production in a real world environment and show value, I think that's when we're going to get more people having interest in what we're doing, and then kind of lay out the roadmap as to what other services we could add and where it will bring value to different entities.
And one other thing, you know, what is our goal? To develop a product that's really usable in a community, or just to show something that's demonstrable and that a bunch of vendors could use and benefit, or that could be deployed in a low resource environment? And I really think that since we've even started this Project Unify, we've seen huge consolidation in the health and human services world, such that you know, the space for small vendors to implement small personal information managers and such that would even be implementable by a community, you know, is a tricky proposition. Like I can just say in like the housing world, you know, there's the few vendors have been gobbled up by venture capitalist firms and such, and so there's fewer leverage points for you know, innovation from a standards point of view. It's a smaller number of actors who are developing this software that is consumed by most communities, and so that's just something we have to really look at. You know, what is a role that this group can really tackle and make a measurable impact in. And so that, you know,
and I would add, and show value to other people. Right. You know, at some point, there's no doubt that anybody who jumps on this call thinks that some of the people on here, me exclusive or me aside, really know what they're talking about. And I believe that many people here really do, but I'm not sure that we're looking at how to bring that to a system level that provides real value to people in the shorter term.
But
so anytime you want to talk about that, Eric, I'm happy to.
That's a great segue, Dave, because I think that is ultimately, you know, I think what, you know, you're bringing the idea a couple of years ago of let's go do something and demonstrate is kind of coming full circle. And I think the opportunity to really go, you know, sort of attempt to do something around consent with our partners in New York and New Jersey and Colorado and California actually presents an opportunity to do that kind of piloting, to be able to point at it, bring together the best and most promising technologies and approaches that are out there today, and be able to point at that, because there's, without that on the ground, even if it's very narrow, without that on the ground actually go do, we won't have, it'll just be another good set of good ideas.
Yeah.
So we're really appreciative of that. And, you know, as I said earlier, you know, that's beginning to get, you know, we're getting some momentum there, and hopefully the resources will arrive to be able to really make that happen as we go forward. So Next week, we'll hear from Conterra. And then the following week, interestingly, I think our colleagues have got a couple of different opportunities. One, our colleagues from California who are trying to do whole person care across the entire state in every county are now actually interested in engaging with the work here, because every county under their new 1115 waiver is going to go try to implement a lot of this stuff in a big way. So there's a group that's pulling all that together. So it's kind of an East Coast, well, not really, it's just a California meets the this work on a significant level. So that should be also quite interesting as we go forward here. So last comments before we close for the day. Matt, I know we looked anxious about saying something, so let me make sure if you wanted to add something before we leave. You're good? Okay. Great. Well, thanks everyone. It was a little bit of a windy conversation. I think it's was helpful for me and hopefully all of you. We'll have it recorded. We'll post it as we always do on the site with the notes and then we'll get some more back out to you next week. If we don't talk to you before then, have a great week and be well.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.